The man who walked out between the armies wasn't a soldier. He ran a wrestling school. He handed generals their towels. And when 50,000 Persian warriors stood watching, waiting to see who Rome would send to answer their champion's challenge, he was the only person who moved. Procopius of Caesarea, who served as Belisarius's legal advisor and accompanied his campaigns and gave us our most detailed account of this battle, records what happened next with the specificity of a man who couldn't believe what he was describing. 25,000 Byzantine soldiers stood behind their trenches. 50,000 Persian warriors stood opposite them. A 2-to-1 numerical advantage that every principle of ancient warfare said was insurmountable. The Byzantine infantry was, by Procopius's own frank assessment, unreliable in open combat against heavy cavalry. And the empire facing them had not lost a major pitched battle in this theater in over a century. So Belisarius dug ditches. And somehow, that was the most dangerous thing anyone had ever done to Persia. But here is what historians have never fully resolved. Why did Perazes, a general from one of the 7 greatest noble families of the Sasanian Empire, commanding the finest cavalry on earth, who had just watched his entire right wing destroyed in what was obviously a geometric trap, immediately send his elite cavalry straight into an identical trap on the opposite wing? He had the numbers to wait. He had the option of withdrawal without disgrace. Something in the Persian military tradition, in the aristocratic identity that the House of Mihran had built over centuries, made retreat psychologically impossible in a way that pure military logic cannot explain. The chronicles record what he did. They never explain what drove him to do it. You will discover that the trench system Belisarius is celebrated for inventing was not invented by him at all. Per historian Irfan Shahid of the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library, he adapted it directly from a Persian tactic that had been used to defeat him personally 2 years earlier. He learned it from the army that beat him. Then he perfected it and turned it against them. You will discover that the man who shattered Persian morale before the main battle even began, a wrestling instructor named Andreas, whose exploits Procopius records in extraordinary biographical detail, disappears from all historical records immediately after his second duel. No reward noted, no later service recorded, no death documented. The man who arguably changed the psychological course of June 530 vanishes entirely. And you will discover that the peace treaty Dara eventually produced was the direct enabling condition for Justinian's reconquest of North Africa, Italy, and the Western Mediterranean, meaning that one June afternoon in a narrow Mesopotamian valley didn't just save a fortress. It built an empire. To understand why an empire's finest cavalry charged into an obvious trap, we need to go back to 524 AD, and the moment a king's demand for religious conversion set 2 superpowers on a collision course that neither could stop. In 524 AD, the King of Kings of Persia looked west toward the Christian kingdom of Iberia and made a demand that his court probably considered entirely reasonable. The Iberians, occupying what is now the eastern Caucasus region of modern Georgia, were Sasanian clients. They had been for generations. Their continued existence as a functioning kingdom depended on Persian tolerance. And now Kavad I, ruler of an empire stretching from the Hindu Kush to the Euphrates, required that they abandon their Christian funeral practices and adopt Zoroastrianism, a matter of religious alignment, a demonstration of loyalty, a perfectly standard imperial demand. The Iberian king Gorgen refused, not diplomatically, not with negotiation, but categorically and immediately. And then, having refused the most powerful ruler in the Eastern world, he did what desperate Christian monarchs did in the 6th century. He fled and appealed to Constantinople, This decision, one king's refusal to change his prayers, triggered a war that would last 6 years, kill tens of thousands, and culminate in one of the most tactically sophisticated battles the ancient world ever produced. But understanding why requires understanding what was actually at stake. Because the Iberian crisis was the visible surface of tensions running far deeper than religion. The Eastern Roman Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire had been the twin superpowers of the known world for centuries. Between them, they controlled the most valuable trade corridors on Earth. The routes that connected the Mediterranean to the silk markets of China and the spice sources of India. Modern historians analyzing the period note that the Byzantine attempts to route silk trade away from Persian middlemen through alliances with Yemen and the Aksumite Empire in Ethiopia had yielded limited results. Persia still controlled the most profitable arteries of commerce in the ancient world, and Rome paid heavily for the privilege of access. The religious dispute over Iberia gave both sides a pretext to contest something much larger than one small kingdom's funeral customs. Emperor Justin I pledged support to Gurgen and dispatched forces to the Caucasus. Then Kavad, showing the diplomatic flexibility of a man who commanded overwhelming force, attempted a maneuver that might have prevented the entire war. He offered Justin the chance to adopt his favored son Khosrau, securing Khosrau's succession and creating a dynastic link between the empires. Justin agreed, but only on condition that the adoption be performed using rites reserved specifically for barbarians. A deliberate, calculated insult that destroyed the negotiations entirely. War followed, and in its early phases, it went badly for Byzantium. Justin dispatched 2 young generals to the eastern frontier, Citas and a man named Belisarius. Both were defeated in their initial engagements. The Persian military machine was exactly as formidable as its reputation suggested, and the Byzantine forces on the eastern frontier had grown accustomed to a defensive posture that bought time but rarely achieved decision. When Justin died in 527 AD and his nephew Justinian inherited the throne, the situation he took over was a frontier under pressure, a war going nowhere productive, and an eastern military that had been consistently outmatched in open engagement. Justinian was a man of enormous ambition and considerable intelligence, but he needed something the Eastern Front desperately lacked: a general capable of changing the strategic calculus rather than merely managing the deterioration. He found one in the same young officer who had already been defeated. He promoted Belisarius to Magister Militum per Orientem, master of the soldiers in the east, and sent him back to the frontier he had previously lost. In 529 AD, Kavad dispatched 40,000 warriors toward the fortress city of Dara. The message was clear. The Iberian War was escalating into something comprehensive, something that would test whether the eastern frontier held or shattered. And the man Justinian had chosen to answer that test was about to make a decision that would determine the next decade of Mediterranean history. He was approximately 25 years old. It was his first independent major command, and everything the ancient world thought it knew about how battles worked was about to be upended. Even his birthplace is disputed by historians. Most scholars point to a town called Germania, a fortified settlement on the borders of Thrace and Paeonia, located in what is now southwestern Bulgaria, as his probable origin. Britannica's entry on Belisarius notes that his exact origins and the precise date of his birth are simply undocumented. He may have been Thraco-Roman or Illyro-Roman. He may have been born closer to 500 or closer to 505 AD. The sources, for all their detail about what he accomplished, are remarkably silent on where he came from and who his family was. What they do tell us is more important than what they don't. He rose through the imperial bodyguard, the household troops of the emperor himself, under Justin I, he was given permission to form his own regiment, the Bucellari, elite heavy cavalry that he paid for, equipped, and trained personally. Procopius, describing Belisarius throughout his account with the reverence of a man who had watched a master at work, emphasizes two qualities above all others: his calm under conditions that would have broken lesser commanders, and his humanity toward the soldiers under his care. In an era of brutal military discipline, Belisarius had a reputation for treating his troops as something more than expendable instruments. This wasn't sentimentality. It was the insight of a commander who understood that soldiers who believed their general cared about their lives fought with different intensity than soldiers who knew they were disposable. The Bucellari he built around himself embodied this philosophy. These weren't typical Byzantine cavalry. Procopius makes clear they were trained in a duel doctrine that most cavalry forces of the era considered mutually exclusive. They could loose arrows from horseback with the precision of the Hunnic horse archers Rome had long feared, and then close with lance and sword for the decisive shock action that heavy cavalry was bred to deliver. This flexibility, this refusal to specialize into a single tactical role, was Belisarius's military philosophy, made visible in horseflesh and iron. He was given shared command with Hermogenes, the Magister Officiorum, master of offices, who would handle diplomatic negotiations and political oversight. Procopius's account, despite its dual command structure, makes clear through the texture of its narrative that when it came to tactical decisions, to the actual direction of forces in the field, Belisarius held the initiative. Hermogenes was capable and experienced. The relationship was collaborative, not merely nominal, but the genius of what would happen at Dara was Belisarius's. And here is the detail that transforms the tactical genius invents brilliant trench system story into something both more honest and more impressive. According to historian Irfan Shahid, writing for the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library, one of the most respected institutions in Byzantine scholarship, the trench system that Belisarius deployed at Dara was not his original invention. The Persians had used trench tactics against him at the Battle of Thanurus in 528 AD, having themselves adapted the technique from the Hephthalites in an earlier conflict. Belisarius had experienced that system firsthand. He had watched it destroy his own army. He had retreated from it. And then he had spent 2 years thinking about what it had done to him, how to make it do the same thing to the people who had used it. Adapting the weapon of the enemy who beat you, refining it, and deploying it against them. That is not the act of a man borrowing someone else's idea. That is the act of a commander who understands that defeat is education if you're paying attention. By the time Belisarius arrived at Dara in 530 AD to face the Persian army that Cavad had sent west, he had been beaten, learned, rebuilt, and returned. The man arriving at this frontier in what was possibly his late 20s was not the same officer who had fled from Thanurus 2 years before. He was carrying a lesson that had cost him everything. And he was about to deliver a bill. The army that Cavad I sent west in 530 AD was not an improvised force dispatched to handle a border problem. It was the distilled military excellence of an empire that had been waging sophisticated warfare since before Rome was founded. Command fell to Perazes, recorded in Byzantine sources as the Miran, a title that Procopius translates as Supreme Commander, though modern scholars note it more likely refers to his family affiliation. The House of Mihran, one of the 7 great noble clans of the Sasanian Empire. These were not merely aristocrats who had purchased their military rank. The Persian system was ruthlessly meritocratic at the command level in ways that Byzantine military culture, with its court politics and imperial favoritism, often was not. The House of Mihran had earned its position through generations of military service. Persian had earned his command through whatever campaigns had preceded this one, though the specific details of his earlier career are not preserved in our sources. He arrived at Dara with 40,000 warriors. Behind him, as the confrontation developed, 10,000 more would march from the Persian stronghold of Nisibis, a city that had once been Roman and whose loss to Persia in 363 AD still rankled Byzantine strategic planners 167 years later. When those reinforcements arrived, Persian would command 50,000 men on this field. Procopius records these numbers explicitly, and modern historians generally accept them as plausible, though the rounded figures of ancient military accounting always carry some margin of uncertainty. The striking power of this army rested on the Savaran, the aristocratic heavy cavalry who were the Sasanian military's primary arm. These were warrior aristocrats, trained from childhood in both riding and fighting, encased in scale or lamellar armor that covered rider and horse alike, armed with long lances for the charge and composite bows for sustained fire and straight swords for the close work that followed. The combat effectiveness of the Savaran derived not just from their equipment or their training, but from something harder to quantify: a generational culture in which military excellence was the definition of aristocratic identity. To fight well was to exist properly. This wasn't enthusiasm that could be manufactured. It was bred. Roman chroniclers identified the most elite element of the Persian force as the Immortals, a unit of legendary reputation. Here, historical honesty requires a pause. Procopius describes Persian elite cavalry at Dara in terms that match what other sources tell us about a unit Romans called the Immortals, known in Persian as the Zayadan. But modern scholars, most notably Tauraj Dariyai of the University of California, Irvine, have cautioned that the 10,000-strong figure Roman sources associate with this unit, and the claim of direct institutional descent from the Achaemenid Immortals of 500 years earlier, likely reflect Roman literary tradition rather than Sasanian institutional reality. A formidable elite cavalry force certainly existed and certainly fought at Dara. Whether it was exactly 10,000 strong or precisely modeled on its Achaemenid predecessors is considerably less certain than the popular narrative suggests. What is certain, because Procopius records it with characteristically blunt assessment, is what the Persian infantry represented tactically: almost nothing. These were conscript levies, peasants equipped with wicker shields and spears, brought along to provide mass during sieges and to hold ground when cavalry needed to maneuver. Procopius preserves what may be Belisarius's own evaluation of them. They were no more soldiers because they carried spears than they would be musicians if given flutes. This wasn't contempt for Persian fighting men generally. It was precise tactical analysis. The Persian military doctrine depended almost entirely on its cavalry. The infantry existed to be expendable, and a commander who understood that could build his entire strategy around exploiting the gap between Persian cavalry excellence and infantry inadequacy. Before the main army had even completed its deployment, Persian sent Belisarius a message. Procopius records its substance: prepare a bath inside Dara, because the Persian commander intended to dine there the following evening as its conqueror. It was the kind of statement that an aristocrat makes when he considers the outcome already settled by mathematics. 50,000 against 25,000. The equation appeared simple. The answer appeared obvious. What Persian hadn't accounted for was a 25-year-old who had spent 2 years designing a counter-argument written in earth and geometry. The city of Dara had been built specifically to be a problem. Emperor Anastasius I had constructed it beginning in 505 AD. a fortress positioned 18 to 22 kilometers northwest of Nisibis, the great Persian stronghold that had been Rome's greatest strategic loss in the 4th century. The placement was deliberate and provocative in precisely the way the Persians understood it to be. A major Roman fortress that close to Nisibis was not a defensive installation in any neutral sense. It was a statement of intent, a projection of power into territory that Persia considered its operational sphere. The Persians viewed Dara's very existence as a treaty violation. They weren't wrong about the strategic logic. The engineering Procopius describes in his work on Justinian's buildings was formidable by any standard of the era. The city walls, later reinforced by Justinian to approximately 20 meters in height at the upper stories, were 4 meters thick, thick enough that siege engines of the period had limited effect against them. The Cords River, a tributary of the Kabur, was diverted through the city itself, providing an internal water supply that made siege by thirst essentially impossible. More ingeniously, engineers constructed an underground channel that could divert the river's flow entirely away from the vicinity, denying water to any besieging force while maintaining supply inside the walls. The Great Cistern, with its multiple parallel chambers, could sustain the population indefinitely, regardless of external conditions. Christopher Lillington Martin, conducting research published by British Archaeological Reports in 2007, combined Procopius's textual descriptions with satellite imagery of the region and identified the probable battlefield approximately 2 to 3 kilometers south of the city. His work confirmed something that had occasionally been doubted. Procopius's geographical account of the battle is accurate enough that modern technology can reconstruct the terrain he was describing. The gap south of Dara, where the river valley narrowed between elevated ground on either side, constrained deployment in exactly the way Procopius's tactical narrative implies. This geography is not incidental detail. It is the first layer of Belisarius's weapon. An army of 50,000 cannot deploy 50,000 warriors simultaneously if terrain forces them into a narrowing corridor. Modern military historians analyzing the Dara battlefield suggest that perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 Persian warriors could engage meaningfully at any given point, given the geographic constraints, meaning that the 2-to-1 numerical advantage Perazes commanded existed in theory, but was partially nullified by the very ground he was crossing before Belisarius had dug a single trench. The fortress walls and city battlements provided Byzantine archers with elevated firing positions that extended the effective reach of the defense. The hills flanking the approach provided concealment for forces Belisarius would position there before the Persians arrived. Perazes' strategic objective at Dara was, in this context, precisely what the provided analysis describes. He could not besiege the city efficiently. A siege of a fortress with Dara's water independence, wall thickness, and internal cistern capacity could last indefinitely, consuming Persian resources and time while Byzantine diplomatic activity continued. The only way to end the threat of Dara quickly was to destroy the Byzantine field army in open battle. Force them out from behind the walls, engage them where Persian cavalry superiority could be brought to bear, and then accept the city's surrender once its military defenders were gone. This is why there had to be a battle at all. Not because Belisarius chose it recklessly, and not because Perazes was simply aggressive. The strategic logic of the situation demanded open engagement. Dara's very impregnability forced both sides onto the plain before its gates. Today, the village of Oğuz in Mardin province of southeastern Turkey sits among what remains of Dara. Archaeological excavations begun in 1986 have uncovered an estimated 10% of the ancient city. The walls still stand, 2.8 kilometers of them visible, the Great Cistern intact. rock-cut tombs in the necropolis carved into the bedrock of the hills. No monuments mark the battlefield. No museum commemorates the 8,000 who died there. Just ruins of a fortress that once anchored an empire's frontier, and fields that have had 15 centuries to forget the blood they received. The walls demanded a battle. Belisarius was already planning what kind. The trenches were not a surprise. Roman military tradition had a sophisticated relationship with field fortification going back centuries. The legion's practice of entrenching every camp, every night, was one of Rome's most famous military disciplines. Persian commanders who had faced Roman armies before would have expected some kind of defensive preparation at Dara. What they would not have expected, what no general in the ancient world had encountered in this form, was what Belisarius actually built. Procopius describes the trench configuration with a precision that has allowed military historians to reconstruct it across 15 centuries. The system was not dug in a straight line, he writes, but in the following manner. In the middle, a rather short portion ran straight. At either end of this central segment, two cross trenches extended forward at right angles, not toward the city, but toward the approaching enemy. And from the tips of these forward extensions, the trenches turned again and ran parallel to the original center line for a considerable distance. The overall shape created a recessed center flanked by forward projecting wings, a geometric configuration that, on the surface, looked like a defensive formation with a weak point in the middle. That appearance was the weapon. At regular intervals along the trenches, Belisarius left earthen bridges, solid ground where his own cavalry could cross to launch counterattacks. The Persians, encountering the trench line, would face solid obstacles that interrupted the momentum of a cavalry charge and forced them into the narrow passageways where they could be struck from multiple angles. Byzantine cavalry could cross freely through the bridges their own engineers had designed. The same ground that channeled Persian attacks created Byzantine opportunity. Here, historical honesty requires acknowledging something that the popular narrative about Dara consistently omits. According to historian Irfan Shahid, this trench concept was not Belisarius's original invention. The Persians had deployed similar tactics against him at Thanuris in 528, having themselves adapted the technique from the Hephthalites. Belisarius had experienced the trench system as a victim. He had retreated from it. What he did at Dara was not invent something new, but refine something he had learned through defeat, transforming a relatively simple Persian application into a geometric system of unprecedented complexity. The sophistication wasn't only in the physical structure, it was in the tactical theory embedded in the design. The recessed center created psychological bait, inviting attacks on the wings where ambushes waited. Standard Persian cavalry doctrine called for hitting flanks, rolling them up, then crushing the center from two sides, a sequence that had won battles from the Hindu Kush to the Bosphorus. Belisarius had built a battlefield where following that doctrine led directly into destruction. The Persians weren't going to be defeated by fighting stupidly. They were going to be defeated by fighting exactly as they had always fought, on ground that had been redesigned to make their strengths into liabilities. Military theorists from Antoine-Henri Jomini in the early 19th century onward would formally codify the principle at work here, operating on interior lines, maintaining a central position that allows rapid movement of reserves to any threatened sector, while the enemy, operating on exterior lines, must travel greater distances to respond. Belisarius was executing this principle 1,500 years before it received its formal name. His position in the center behind the recessed trench gave him observation over both wings and the ability to shift forces laterally through the interior space without crossing his own front line. The Persians, attacking the wings from outside, would have to go around. Lillington Martin's satellite imagery work confirmed that the topography of the area south of Dara matches Procopius's description closely enough to identify the probable location of the trench system itself. This wasn't literary invention or historical embellishment. Procopius was describing a real structure on a real landscape, and what he described was genuinely without precedent in the surviving military literature of the ancient world. The trap was set. Now Belisarius needed the Persians to walk into it with confidence. And a man who handed generals their towels was about to provide that confidence. Picture the gap south of Dara as Belisarius saw it on the morning of the main engagement. Directly in front, the recessed central segment of the trench line, seemingly the most vulnerable point in the entire Byzantine position. The place a Persian commander's instincts would identify as the obvious weak spot to strike. On either side of that apparent weakness, the forward-projecting lateral trenches created covered positions for cavalry that could see anyone approaching the center, but could not easily be flanked by forces attacking that center. Behind the northern hill on the extreme left flank, completely invisible to Persian scouts who had passed that ground on their approach, 300 Heruli cavalry under their chieftain Phares, waiting with the discipline of hunters who understood that a single premature movement would waste the only advantage surprise could provide. At the interior angles of the trench system, the points where the cross trenches met the lateral extensions, 1,200 Hunnic horse archers waited in two groups. 600 under Sunicus and Igon on the left, 600 more under Simas and Ascan on the right. These were Federate warriors, men recruited from the Eurasian steppes, whose grandfathers had terrorized Rome and who now fought for Byzantine gold. Their composite bows could put arrows through armor at ranges that shorter bows couldn't reach. Their mobility, honed across generations of mounted warfare on the endless grasslands, made them capable of striking, withdrawing, and striking again faster than heavier cavalry could respond. On the left wing, Buzes commanded the main Byzantine cavalry. On the right, John the Armenian, Procopius identifies him as Belisarius's trusted boyhood friend and lieutenant, held the corresponding position. Both were experienced officers who had been given clear instructions: absorb the Persian assault, hold as long as possible, and trust the system. In the center, behind the infantry that Procopius makes no effort to pretend was anything other than unreliable in open combat, Belisarius and Hermogenes waited with the Butsalari reserve. This was the fulcrum position, the place from which both wings could be observed simultaneously, from which reserves could be deployed through the interior space in either direction, from which the entire battlefield geometry could be read and responded to. The commander who holds interior lines can mass at the decision point faster than the commander operating on exterior lines. Belisarius had designed his entire formation around making that truth decisive. Opposite this arrangement, the Persian deployment was textbook doctrine. Perazes took the center with the bulk of his forces. Pityaxes commanded the right wing. The one-eyed Barismanas commanded the left. The elite cavalry, what Roman sources called the Immortals, were positioned as a reserve to be committed when and where breakthrough seemed achievable. The Persian infantry, vast in numbers and negligible in tactical utility, filled the center formation in depth. Procopius records that they deployed approximately 20 stades from Dara, roughly 3.7 to 4.2 kilometers, a distance Lillington Martin's recalibration of Procopius's measurements refined slightly from earlier estimates. Close enough to be imposing, far enough to have room for the full deployment their numbers required. The timing of the main assault was midday. Whether this was deliberate calculation, exploiting the summer Mesopotamian heat and the Byzantine lunch schedule, or simply the reality of how long it takes to deploy 50,000 warriors, Procopius doesn't explicitly state. Modern historians analyzing the battle have suggested the former. The summer sun over northern Mesopotamia generates temperatures that modern weather records suggest could exceed 45 degrees Celsius, and an army that had eaten a substantial meal at dawn and then stood in formation for hours would be considerably less effective than one that had just arrived fresh. If Perazes was calculating this, Belisarius anticipated it. Procopius notes the Byzantines prepared accordingly. The armies faced each other across the gap. The trenches waited. The Heruli crouched behind their hill, and somewhere between the two lines, a man who ran a wrestling school was about to become the most important individual in a battle between empires. Day one of the confrontation did not produce a general engagement. Instead, it produced something that military historians have been arguing about ever since. Procopius records that Persian cavalry probed the Byzantine left in the afternoon of the first day, a standard reconnaissance in force, testing the ground and the Byzantine reaction times. Baucis's forces drove them off, and Procopius gives us the casualty count with the specificity that characterizes his best reporting. 7 Persians dead, none of the probe's tactical objectives accomplished. Then the theater began. A young Persian horseman rode out from the Persian lines and into the open ground between the armies, issuing a challenge in the tradition that had existed across multiple warrior cultures for centuries. Single combat, any Byzantine brave enough to accept. This was psychological warfare dressed as honor. The Persians expected either a Byzantine champion, who their warrior would probably defeat, demoralizing the defenders, or a refusal, which would paint Rome as cowardly. What they got was neither. Procopius identifies the Byzantine respondent with biographical precision. A man named Andreas, a trainer of youths in charge of a wrestling school in Byzantium, the personal attendant of the General Baucis. Not a soldier, not even a member of the military in any formal sense. A civilian athlete who happened to be present at one of the defining military confrontations of the 6th century. Here, Procopius's account requires honest engagement with its limitations. The Wikipedia article on the Battle of Dara notes that another source from this period, believed by scholars to be based on official military documents rather than literary narrative, does confirm that individual combat occurred at Dara, but makes no mention of Andreas by name, and places the single combat episodes at a different stage of the battle entirely. Some historians read Procopius's Andreas account as a narrative device rather than a strictly factual report. An episode crafted with deliberate literary purpose, possibly drawing on the conventions of classical historiography, in which dramatic individual moments illuminate larger themes. Connor Whately's scholarly study of Procopius, published by Brill in 2015, argues that Procopius's literary craftsmanship does not automatically undermine his historical reliability, but that awareness of his classical models is necessary context for reading his most dramatic passages. What the scholarly consensus accepts: individual combat did occur at Dara. It involved Byzantine victory, and it meaningfully affected the morale of both armies. The specific biographical details surrounding Andreas may reflect Procopius's storytelling artistry as much as strict documentation. With that framing established, what Procopius records is this: Andreas accepted the challenge without orders, armed with a spear and a small knife. The Persian champion charged. Andreas drove the spear into his opponent's right breast, unhorsed him, and killed him on the ground. Procopius preserves the specific phrase he uses for the killing blow, slew him like a sacrificial animal, and records that a roar went up from the Byzantine lines and from the soldiers watching on Dara's walls. A second Persian champion rode out older and more experienced, carrying a whip alongside his weapons. The visual signal of a man who considered this exercise already beneath his dignity. Andreas accepted again. Both lances shattered on impact. Both horses went down. In the chaos of the fall, the wrestling instructor recovered faster than the armored Persian knight. The second champion died on the ground, like the first. 2 Persian champions, 2 defeats, at the hands of a man who cleaned other men's sweat for a living. For soldiers whose entire military identity rested on the myth of Persian cavalry invincibility, this was not merely a tactical setback. It was a crack in something that had seemed structural. After the second duel, combat ceased for the day, and Procopius never mentions Andreas again. Not in the main battle, not in any subsequent campaign, not anywhere in his voluminous account of Belisarius's career. The man who delivered what may have been the most psychologically significant moment of the entire Dara encounter disappears from history as completely as if the ground swallowed him. Whatever rewards came to him, whatever military commission or land grant or monetary compensation standard practice would have suggested, none of it was deemed worth recording. History preserved his 2 duels. It forgot everything that followed. The night between day 1 and day 2 was not quiet in any meaningful sense. Procopius records that Belisarius dispatched a letter to Perazes after the day's skirmishing. Its text is partially preserved, and the words carry the specific gravity of a document written by a man who had built an elaborate trap and was now, perhaps, genuinely hoping he wouldn't need to spring it. "The first blessing is peace," the letter read, as is agreed by all men who have even a small share of reason. The best general, therefore, is that one which is able to bring about peace from war. Why Belisarius sent this letter is a question historians have answered differently depending on what they believe he understood about his own situation. Anthony Brogna, writing on Belisarius's generalship, argues it reflects simply the general's moral character, a genuine preference for resolution over bloodshed, if resolution was possible. Lord Mahon, writing a biography of Belisarius in the 19th century, took the opposite view, that Belisarius doubted his own chances of victory, and the letter was the calculated gesture of a commander who wasn't entirely sure his trap would work. Both readings are plausible. Neither is verifiable. The letter's true motivation died with the man who wrote it. Perazes' response did not engage with the letter's substance. It was, by any measure, the most expensive arrogance of the 6th century. He sent word back to Belisarius: "Prepare a bath inside Dara." He intended to dine there the following evening as its conqueror. This message should be understood in the context that produced it, rather than simply dismissed as personal hubris, though personal hubris was certainly present. Perazes was a commander from one of the greatest aristocratic families in the Persian Empire, commanding 50,000 warriors against 25,000, facing an opponent who had previously lost on this same frontier. Every calculation of military logic supported his confidence. The Persian army had not lost a major pitched engagement in this theater in over a century. The Byzantine force facing him included infantry that Procopius himself admitted was unreliable against heavy cavalry. The mathematics of the situation appeared, to any rational observer, to favor the Persians decisively. That night, 10,000 more Persian warriors marched from Nisibis and joined the camp at Amodius. When they arrived, Perazes commanded exactly 50,000 men. The 2-to-1 advantage complete. The arithmetic of expected outcome seemingly settled. Across the gap, Byzantine soldiers prepared for what they knew was coming. Some had watched 2 Persian champions fall to a civilian athlete. All had spent their first night in positions that Belisarius had designed and explained. They were outnumbered. They knew it. but they were behind trenches that had been built with specific mathematical intent. And their commander had positioned reserves in places the Persians hadn't looked. The summer sun rose over northern Mesopotamia. The armies deployed once more. And Perazes, who had arrived expecting a bath, ordered the first serious assault of the campaign. The arrow storm came first. Procopius describes the opening of the main engagement with a phrase that military historians have quoted for 15 centuries. Both sides discharged arrows against each other, and the missiles by their great number made, as it were, a vast cloud. This was not metaphor. The Persian army's numerical advantage translated directly into an advantage in bowmen. More archers, more arrows, the ability to rotate fresh shooters forward while exhausted men rested, maintaining continuous pressure on the Byzantine lines. Standard military doctrine of the period held that the side with more archers won the archery duel, and the side that won the archery duel broke the enemy's cohesion before cavalry ever charged. The opening phase should, by every calculation of ancient military theory, have shattered Byzantine defensive coherence. Standard doctrine was about to have an encounter with meteorology. Procopius records what happened with the calm of a man documenting something he recognized as consequential. A steady wind blew from the Byzantine position toward the Persians and checked to a considerable degree the force of their arrows. Persian arrows, loosed into a headwind, lost range and striking power. Byzantine arrows, carried by a following wind, flew farther and hit harder. The same atmospheric conditions that handicapped one side amplified the other. Here, the historical record requires honest engagement with its own uncertainty. The Wikipedia article on the Battle of Dara notes that historians reading Procopius's account of the arrow exchange have reached substantially different conclusions. Some interpret Procopius as indicating the Persians had the better of the exchange despite the wind. Others read him as describing rough equivalents. Others take Procopius's phrase, "The Byzantines did not have the worst of it," as suggesting Byzantine advantage. These are not minor quibbling differences. They reflect genuine scholarly disagreement about how to read a single ancient source. The methodology that had won battles across 3 continents, saturate the enemy with missile fire, break his cohesion, then send cavalry through a shattered formation, was producing inconclusive results against 25,000 men hiding behind ditches and earthen bridges in a narrow Mesopotamian valley. The arrow storm ended, not because either side ran out of arrows or lost the will to continue, but because neither side had broken. And Perazes, commanding a force that had come here specifically to destroy the Byzantine field army and leave Dara defenseless, faced the logical consequence. If archery hadn't done it, cavalry would have to. He ordered pity axes to take the right wing forward against Bauses. The trap's first jaw was about to close. The assault on the Byzantine left was everything Sasanian heavy cavalry doctrine promised. Thousands of armored horsemen under pity axes drove across the gap toward Bauses' position, navigating the earthen bridges through the trench line with the controlled determination of professional cavalry executing a maneuver they had trained for. They struck Bauses' cavalry with the accumulated weight of armored horses at speed. And the initial result was exactly what Persian doctrine predicted. The Byzantine left gave ground. Bauses' men fought, but they withdrew. The Persian cavalry pushed through the trench crossing and advanced deeper into Byzantine territory, their momentum carrying them forward in the pattern that had worked across the known world. Hit the flank, roll it up, then turn inward against the exposed side of the enemy center. They advanced past the northern hill. 300 Heruli cavalry had been crouching behind that hill since before the Persian vanguard had arrived. Faris had positioned them there, completely concealed, completely silent, waiting with a patience that required them to listen to the arrow storm and the crash of cavalry engagement without moving, without responding, without giving away the ambush that the entire left-wing battle plan depended on. Now, as Pityaxis' forces pushed past the hill's concealment and exposed their rear, Phares gave the order. Procopius records the impact with the economy of a writer who understood that sometimes the facts require no embellishment. The Heruli struck the Persian right in the rear. Simultaneously, the timing is the tactical achievement here, the coordination that transforms two separate counterattacks into one overwhelming encirclement. Sunicus and Aigen led their 600 Huns through the earthen bridges at the left trench angle and drove into the Persian right flank from the interior position. Pityaxis' force, which moments before had been advancing with the confidence of cavalry pressing a faltering enemy, found itself under attack from three directions simultaneously. From the rear, Phares' Heruli, 300 warriors whose value derived from hitting at exactly the moment and from exactly the direction no one had prepared for. From the flank, 600 Hunnic horse archers whose composite bows turned the narrow corridor into a killing zone. From the front, Bausis' cavalry, which had been withdrawing, fighting retreat, not rout, now halted, turned, and countercharged into the Persian force that was already reeling from two unexpected vectors of attack. The trenches that the Persians had just crossed became walls of a pocket. The same earthen obstacles that had slowed their advance now blocked their lateral escape. Warriors committed to a forward assault, suddenly struck from multiple angles in terrain that prevented reorganization, died in the confusion that follows when tactical shock is complete and command coherence shatters. Procopius estimates approximately 3,000 Persian dead in the right-wing destruction. The figure is his, from the Byzantine side, and ancient battle accounting was rarely precise. But it represents his assessment of the magnitude of the disaster, and modern historians generally accept it as reflecting the order of magnitude accurately, if not the exact count. Belisarius and Hermogenes, according to Procopius, immediately ordered the victorious left wing to halt. No pursuit, hold position, maintain formation. This decision, made in the flush of sudden decisive success, when every instinct would scream to press the advantage, was as important as the encirclement itself. A general who destroys one Persian wing and then lets his left wing fragment in pursuit has no left wing when the crisis comes on the right. Belisarius knew the battle wasn't over. He was right. On the opposite side of the field, 3,000 Persian dead and a shattered right wing had not changed Phares' fundamental calculation. He still commanded 47,000 warriors. The math of the overall engagement, still on paper, favored him, and he had something left that he hadn't committed yet. He committed it. Here is where the battle should have ended. On paper, the situation still favored Persia decisively. One wing had been destroyed, but the left wing remained intact. The center was unengaged, and Phares still had available what Roman sources called the Immortals, the elite cavalry reserve that had been positioned precisely for moments when inferior forces threatened to upset the expected outcome. The logical response to the disaster on the right was to overwhelm the Byzantine right with the most formidable force available. Break through there, roll up the Byzantine flank, cut off the city, make the mathematics reassert themselves. Phares reinforced his left wing with the elite cavalry that Procopius's account associates with forces historians identify as the Immortals. And here, again, the necessary scholarly qualification. Tuaraj Daryai's work on Sasanian military history cautions that the 10,000-strong figure Roman sources associate with this designation, and the notion of direct institutional descent from the Achaemenid Immortals of Herodotus, likely reflects Roman literary convention more than Sasanian organizational reality. What we can say with confidence is that Perazes committed his best remaining cavalry to the left wing under Barismanes, the one-eyed general whose physical description Procopius provides with the specificity of first-hand reporting, and sent them against John the Armenian's position on the Byzantine right. The assault was overwhelming in a way that the Pityax's attack on the left had never managed to be. The elite cavalry that Barismanes led drove into John's forces with the concentrated weight of the finest heavy cavalry in the ancient world, and the Byzantine right could not hold against it. John's men fought. They gave ground fighting, not fleeing, the distinction that Procopius makes clear in his account. But they were pushed back, step by step, toward the walls of Dara itself. From outside the battle, from the perspective of any observer without knowledge of what Belisarius had positioned where, this must have looked like the beginning of Byzantine collapse. The Byzantine right was retreating toward the gates. The Persian elite cavalry was advancing with the momentum of warriors who had never been stopped when they were fully committed. Barismanes's forces had advanced so far, so fast, pressing John's withdrawing cavalry so aggressively, that a gap had opened between the Persian left wing and the Persian center, a separation created by the very speed and depth of their success. Modern military analysts reading Procopius identify this gap as the tactical pivot of the entire battle. The Persian left had advanced farther than its supporting units could follow, creating a pocket of open space between itself and the Persian center. The Immortals, or whatever formation Barismanes commanded, were now separated from the forces that should have been covering their flank. They were committed to a deep penetration, focused entirely on destroying John's cavalry, operating in isolation from the rest of the Persian army. Belisarius, from his central position behind the recessed trench, could see this. The Persian cavalry committed to their assault could not. 3 seconds, perhaps. Though Procopius doesn't record how long the decision took, only that it was made and executed with the precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. And Belisarius gave the order. Everything moved at once. Procopius records that Belisarius committed his remaining uncommitted forces, Sunicus's Huns, who had already helped destroy the Persian right wing and been repositioned through the interior space behind the central trench, and the Bucellari, the elite personal cavalry regiment that Belisarius had built, paid for, and trained himself. He doesn't give us exact numbers for the reserve. He gives us the result. The movement that followed exploited the single most important design feature of the entire trench system. The interior space behind the central trench, the corridor that the recessed geometry had deliberately preserved, allowed cavalry to move laterally behind the Byzantine position without crossing the front line or threading through units engaged with the enemy. Belisarius's reserves wheeled across the battlefield through this corridor, moving from the center toward the Byzantine right, approaching the gap between the Persian left and the Persian center, from an angle that Barismanes, focused on destroying John's cavalry in front of him, had left completely unguarded. The encirclement happened in the sequence that Procopius describes with the economy of a military historian who recognized the precision of the execution. John the Armenian's retreating cavalry, pushed back almost to Dara's gates, fighting their rearguard action, suddenly halted, turned, and countercharged. At the same moment, Belisarius's reserves drove into the gap from the flank and rear, splitting the Persian left wing from its supporting forces and cutting off the avenue of retreat. The elite Persian cavalry found itself fighting in 3 directions simultaneously. In front of them, John's forces, which had been apparently collapsing moments before, were now pressing them back. On their flank and rear, fresh Byzantine cavalry and Hunnic horse archers were driving into the separation between the Persian left and center. The hills and the city walls prevented lateral escape. The gap between the Persian left and center prevented immediate reinforcement from the still unengaged Persian infantry mass. In the epicenter of that chaos, Sunicus, the Hun commander who had already helped destroy the right wing, fought his way through the melee to Barismanus. Procopius records the outcome. Sunicus killed Barismanus, and Sunicus captured his battle standard, the command flag that represented Barismanus's authority and the cohesion of his entire force. The impact of a commander's death and a standard's capture in ancient warfare was not symbolic. It was structural. Ancient armies depended on personal leadership and visual command signals in ways that modern military organizations with hierarchical succession plans do not. When the standard fell, the cohesive identity of the unit fell with it. Not because soldiers suddenly became cowards, but because the signal network that told them where to move, what to do, and whether the situation was recoverable had been severed at its root. The Persian left was destroyed as a fighting force in the pocket that followed. Procopius estimates more than 5,000 dead in this phase of the battle. His tally for the second encirclement, bringing the documented Persian casualties to over 8,000 dead from the two wing battles alone. The pursuit casualties that followed would add to this total without a specific number Procopius chose to record. 8,000 Persian warriors. In an army of 50,000, that was 16%. Catastrophic by ancient battle standards for elite cavalry units whose training represented years of investment and whose experience was genuinely irreplaceable. The mathematics that should have guaranteed Persian victory had been rewritten. In the Persian center, the infantry and remaining cavalry, who had not yet struck a single blow, watched both wings disintegrate. They watched the standard fall. They saw what happened to the finest cavalry in Asia inside a geometric trap built from ditches and timing, and a young commander who had refused to accept that superior numbers meant inevitable defeat. And then they ran. Procopius records what followed with the brevity of a man documenting something that required no dramatic elaboration. The Persian center, tens of thousands of infantry and remaining cavalry who had never engaged the Byzantine line, threw down their wicker shields. They abandoned their formations. They fled toward the camp at Amodius without orders, without organization, without any of the discipline that distinguished a tactical withdrawal from a rout. The distinction matters. A tactical withdrawal is organized, covering, and potentially reversible. What Procopius describes is comprehensive psychological collapse, units dissolving rather than retreating, the discipline that had been trained into thousands of men evaporating in the face of what they had just witnessed. Both wings destroyed, the immortals encircled and shattered, the standard fallen, the commander dead, and the Byzantine center, which had not yet been meaningfully engaged, was still intact behind its trenches, with reserves presumably available for another devastating counterstroke. Persian infantry, in this situation, made the only calculation that remained available to them. Survival mattered more than honor, and the road back to Nisibis was 18 kilometers of open ground. Byzantine cavalry pursued. The narrow approach that had constrained Persian deployment during the advance now turned the retreat into a compounding disaster. Tens of thousands of men and horses attempting to move through the same corridor simultaneously, the panic of the rout multiplying casualties through collision and trampling as much as through Byzantine blades. Procopius records the pursuit continued for a distance he describes without specifying an exact figure in hours or kilometers. Far enough to inflict additional casualties, not so far as to reach the Persian camp. Then Belisarius called it off. Procopius preserves his reasoning explicitly, and it deserves to be quoted rather than paraphrased. Belisarius and Hermogenes, Procopius writes, refused absolutely to let the pursuit go farther, fearing lest the Persians through some necessity should turn about and rout them while pursuing recklessly, and it seemed to them sufficient to preserve the victory unmarred. This was not excessive caution or failure of nerve. It was the precise opposite. A commander who understood the difference between a battle won and an army preserved, who recognized that Persian forces were famous for their capacity to execute feigned retreats and turn overconfident pursuers into victims, and who judged that the victory already achieved was worth more than the additional casualties that uncontrolled pursuit might provide. The battlefield Perazes left behind told its own story about the completeness of the collapse. Siege equipment capable of reducing fortress walls, catapults, and associated machinery that represented months of manufacturing and transport was abandoned in the flight. Supplies for a campaign, personal standards of officers, items that Persian warriors would normally die defending, left behind when survival became paramount over honor. Procopius ends his account of the battle with a line whose understatement carries the weight of what it's describing. On that day, the Persians had been defeated in battle by the Romans, a thing which had not happened for a long time. He wasn't recording a minor engagement. He was recording the moment that century-long assumptions about the military balance between two empires had been proven contingent. 25,000 held, 50,000 broke. The mathematics had been rewritten, and the man who had rewritten them was riding back toward a fortress that now had to be understood differently. Not as a defensive structure barely surviving, but as the centerpiece of a frontier that had just proven it could win. Dawn on the day after the battle revealed the arithmetic of what geometry had accomplished. Persian dead concentrated in two areas. The right-wing killing pocket where Pharis's Heruli had struck from behind, and Sunicus's Huns from the flank, while Baucis's cavalry countercharged from the front. And the left-wing encirclement where John's rallied troops and Belisarius's reserves had destroyed the Persian elite between three converging forces. Procopius's phase tallies, approximately 3,000 on the right, more than 5,000 on the left, give a combined figure of over 8,000 dead on the field, with additional casualties from the pursuit that he doesn't separately enumerate. Byzantine casualties Procopius does not record. This was a common practice in ancient victory accounts. Minimizing the documentation of friendly losses emphasized the decisiveness of the outcome, without requiring the narrator to dwell on the price of victory. Modern military historians, analyzing the battle's structure and the protective geometry of the trench positions, have speculated that Byzantine losses were significantly lower than Persian. But this is analytical inference, not documentation. We simply do not know what June 530 cost the Byzantine army in dead and wounded. The silence in the record is itself a kind of historical fact. It tells us Procopius didn't feel the need to explain or minimize a high Byzantine toll. For the people behind those numbers, Persian soldiers who had marched from Nisibis with the confidence of warriors who had never lost in these odds. The calculus was different from anything Procopius's military analysis captures. 8,000 dead represented 8,000 families, 8,000 sets of skills and experiences and irreplaceable trained cavalry instincts that the Sasanian military system had spent years developing. The destruction of elite cavalry units isn't just a tactical setback. It is a wound to the social structure of the warrior aristocracy that produced them. Perazes returned to Persia. Wikipedia's article on him, drawing on Martindale's prosopography of the later Roman Empire, confirms what happened next in the briefest possible terms. After his defeat at Dara, he was disgraced by the Persian Shah Kavad I. Nothing else is known of his life. the man who had sent the Bath message, who had commanded 50,000 of the finest warriors the ancient world could assemble, vanishes from history at the moment of his disgrace. Historians of Sasanian court culture note that public revocation of aristocratic insignia, the visible stripping of the symbols that defined a man's place in the imperial hierarchy, was the standard instrument of royal censure in Persian noble culture. Whether Perazes faced exactly that, or some other form of public demotion, the surviving sources don't say with specificity. Only the fact is documented. He fell. Barismanes lay on the field where Sunicus had killed him. His standard had been captured. His unit had been destroyed. His command was over in the most definitive sense available. Pityaxes, commander of the destroyed right wing, simply disappears from the record. Procopius, meticulous about the battle itself, has nothing to say about his fate, killed in the destruction of his command or among those who fled. The sources don't specify, and history has not preserved the answer. And Andreas, the wrestling instructor who had walked out between two armies carrying a borrowed spear, the man whose 2 victories over Persian champions had cracked the psychological armor of an army before the main battle even began. Procopius mentions him, names him, describes his profession and his fighting technique, records both duels with the specificity of reportage, and then never mentions him again. Not in the battle, not in the aftermath, not in any of the subsequent campaigns that Procopius chronicles in detail. The man who may have changed the psychological course of June 530 disappears from all surviving records as completely as if he had never existed beyond those 2 improbable duels. Victory remembers commanders and systems. It forgets the individuals who made both possible. The victory was real. Its limits were equally real, and honesty about both is what distinguishes history from mythology. Dara demonstrated that a Byzantine army under the right commander, in the right terrain, with the right preparation and the right disposition of forces, could defeat a Persian army twice its size. That demonstration had profound consequences. For Byzantine morale, for Persian strategic calculation, for Justinian's understanding of what his eastern frontier could achieve. But it demonstrated something else as well, something that became visible 1 year later. In 531 AD, Belisarius faced Persian forces again at the Battle of Callinicum. The strategic circumstances were different. The Persians had sent an expeditionary force under the general Azarethes via a route through Commagene that Belisarius had not anticipated. And the campaign had developed in ways that gave Belisarius neither the terrain advantage nor the prepared position he had built at Dara. Under pressure from his own soldiers, who reportedly threatened mutiny if no battle was fought, Belisarius engaged. He lost. The scholarly analysis of why is instructive. Wikipedia's entry on Belisarius, drawing on the consensus of his biographers, notes that at Callinicum, he positioned himself at lower ground and could not see when the enemy concentrated to achieve breakthrough. He had created no reserve force at all, the single most critical tactical lesson that Dara should have reinforced. And when the Persians found the gap, there was nothing available to plug it. The general who had held interior lines with textbook precision at Dara had abandoned the principles that made interior lines work. Belisarius was recalled to Constantinople and faced a commission of inquiry into the defeat. He was ultimately exonerated, cleared of the charge of incompetence, his reputation damaged but not destroyed, and Justinian restored him to command. But the commission itself is historically significant. Even the victor of Dara, even the man whose tactical brilliance had just reset the strategic balance of the eastern frontier, was accountable to a system that examined failure without deference to previous success. The episode teaches a lesson that the battle itself obscures if read too reverentially. tactical genius is not a property that transfers automatically from one situation to the next. The principles Belisarius demonstrated at Dara, terrain analysis, prepared positions, combined arms coordination, reserve timing, interior lines, are genuinely foundational. They appear in military doctrine across centuries for reasons that are geometrically valid. But executing them requires conditions: the right terrain, the right information about enemy intentions, the right disposition of forces before contact, and a commander who maintains his observational clarity under pressure. At Dara, Belisarius had all of those things. At Callinicum, he had fewer of them, and the result was different. The victory wasn't permanent. The lesson was, and the victory, brief as its direct military consequences were, had purchased something that a military genius who lost the next battle and was recalled for inquiry still managed to leverage into history. The Sasanian Empire was not destroyed at Dara. It wasn't even permanently weakened. But the battle, combined with Byzantine success at Satala later in 530 and continued Persian setbacks, shifted the strategic calculation in ways that had consequences far beyond the Mesopotamian frontier. When Kavad I died in 531 AD, and his son Khosrau I, the same prince whose proposed adoption had originally shattered diplomatic relations, assumed the throne, Khosrau faced internal dynastic pressures and a military establishment that had just experienced multiple defeats. The psychological weight of what had happened at Dara, where 50,000 warriors had been routed by 25,000 in prepared positions, had undermined the assumption of inevitable Persian superiority that made cities surrender without siege. In 532 AD, both empires signed what they called the Treaty of Eternal Peace. The terms require honest examination, because they don't look like the terms of a decisive Byzantine victory. Justinian agreed to pay 11,000 pounds of gold to Persia toward the maintenance of the Caucasian defensive passes against nomadic incursions, a payment that had precedent before the war. The military headquarters of the eastern frontier would move from Dara to the more inland city of Constantia. In return, all captured territories would be returned to their pre-war holders. The fortress of Dara would remain Byzantine, and the frontier integrity of the Eastern Roman position would be maintained. This was not Byzantine triumph. It was mutual exhaustion, finding a face-saving formula. Both sides had fought to inconclusive results despite Dara and Satala. The Persians needed breathing space to manage Khosrau's succession and consolidate internal power. Justinian needed something far more valuable than a continuation of this border war. He needed time. And 8 years of it, as it turned out, was enough to change the Mediterranean world. With the eastern frontier stabilized by treaty, with the Persian threat temporarily neutralized, Justinian could look west toward the ambition that defined his reign: the Renovatio Imperii, the reconquest of the territories that Rome's western dissolution had surrendered. The causal chain from Dara to the reconquest is direct and documented. Without the eternal peace, Justinian could not strip the eastern frontier of Belisarius and an expeditionary army. The Persians would have exploited the absence immediately. The peace made the western campaigns possible, and the peace was the consequence of what happened at Dara. In 533 AD, Belisarius sailed for North Africa at the head of an expedition that Procopius accompanied and chronicled. His target was the Vandal kingdom that had seized Rome's wealthiest African provinces a century earlier. The campaign was swift by any standard. At the Battle of Tricamarum in December 533, Belisarius destroyed the Vandal field army. By March 534, Carthage was Roman again, and the Vandal kingdom had ceased to exist as a political entity. Italy followed. From 535 onward, Belisarius's campaigns took Sicily, Naples, and Rome itself. The Eternal City re-entering the Roman orbit for the first time since 476 AD. By 540, he had captured Ravenna and effectively ended the Ostrogothic kingdom as a military power. The Eternal Peace, Khosrau I, broke it and invaded Syria in 540 AD, proving the treaty's name to be the most inaccurate label in 6th century diplomacy. Lasted exactly 8 years. But those 8 years were the years that made Justinian's vision of reconquest a reality rather than an aspiration. The trenches south of Dara didn't just win an afternoon. They purchased the time that changed the map of the Mediterranean world. Ask 100 people with more than passing interest in ancient history to name a significant battle of the 6th century. Almost none will say Dara. This is worth understanding, because the gap between Dara's tactical and strategic significance and its place in popular historical memory is itself a historical phenomenon that follows recognizable patterns. The source problem explains the largest share of the obscurity. Procopius of Caesarea provides our only detailed account of the battle. One of the most thorough battle descriptions in all of late antique literature. But still a single voice with acknowledged biases and literary purposes. John Malalas mentions the conflict briefly. Zacharias of Mytilene's Syriac Chronicle notes its existence. No Sasanian sources survive from this period. Whatever Persian records documented their perspective on June 530 were lost to the chaos of later centuries and the Islamic conquest that eventually transformed the Sasanian Empire's successor states. A battle documented primarily by one side in one tradition does not accumulate the cross-referencing and comparative analysis that preserves military engagements across centuries of reinterpretation. The outcome problem compounds the source problem. Dara was a tactical masterpiece that produced a strategic stalemate. No territory permanently changed hands. The Eternal Peace required Byzantine gold. The frontier that Belisarius had defended so brilliantly remained essentially where it had been. Two empires locked in the mutual exhaustion that would eventually leave both of them vulnerable to something neither had imagined. Compare this to Actium, which ended the Roman civil wars and established an emperor, or Adrianople in 378 AD, which shattered Roman military power and opened the gates to the Germanic migrations that ended the Western Empire. Decisive strategic outcomes that change political realities tend to be remembered. Tactical brilliance that leads to negotiated stalemates tends to fade. Then there is the narrative problem, and it may be the most fundamental. Dara's achievement is technical. The geometry of the trenches, the coordination of heterogeneous forces across multiple axes, the precise timing of reserve deployment through interior lines. These are concepts that require military knowledge to fully appreciate. They are genuinely harder to dramatize than 300 Spartans holding a mountain pass against 1,000,000 Persians. Thermopylae offers a story that anyone can feel in their chest. Dara offers a masterclass in applied geometry. Both are historically important. Only one makes people stop scrolling. The rediscovery, when it came from an unexpected direction. Christopher Lillington Martin's archaeological and topographical research, published by British Archaeological Reports in 2007, used satellite imagery and field visits to confirm that Procopius's account of the battlefield matches the actual landscape south of Dara with remarkable precision. The document published by the Defense Technical Information Center, the American Military Research Repository, explicitly identifies Dara as a battle studied for its demonstration that terrain can function as a force multiplier and that numerical inferiority need not determine outcome. Military institutions study Dara not because ancient battles translate directly to modern mechanized warfare, but because the underlying principles, the ones that made trenches in 530 the functional equivalent of what Jomini would call the decisive point 2 centuries later, are as geometrically valid in the 21st century as they were in the 6th. The 4 lessons that survive the technological gap are these. Terrain analysis is not preliminary to tactics. It is tactics, because the side that controls where and how combat occurs has already made the most important decision before a weapon is raised. Combined arms coordination, the integration of different capabilities so that each one's effectiveness multiplies the others, rather than each one operating in isolation, requires the kind of unified command that Belisarius exercised over Byzantine regulars, Hunnic federates, and Heruli allies simultaneously. Reserve timing is the art of war's most difficult single skill, knowing when to commit the uncommitted force, which requires holding it back past the point where every instinct screams to send it forward. And the limits of genius, demonstrated by Callinicum, remain the most useful lesson of all, because commanders who study Dara without studying Callinicum learn only that Belisarius was brilliant, while commanders who study both learn that brilliance requires conditions that must be created and maintained rather than assumed. Dara didn't fail to be remembered because it wasn't important enough. It failed to be remembered because the world that produced it, the Byzantine-Sasanian rivalry that would eventually exhaust both empires into vulnerability before the Arab expansion of the 7th century, disappeared from the political stage before it could establish the commemorative tradition that keeps battles alive. Neither the medieval Byzantine rump state nor the Islamic caliphates that replaced both empires had particular reason to celebrate a battle from the old rivalry. The triumphalist narrative that preserves military victories requires a political entity to claim the legacy. When that entity fragments or is conquered, battlefield memories fragment with it. The wonder, 15 centuries later, is not that Dara faded from popular consciousness. The wonder is that we know about it at all. The battlefield today carries no markers commemorating what happened there. The village of Oz in Mardin province of southeastern Turkey, 30 kilometers from the modern city of Mardin, 6 kilometers from the Syrian border, sits among and on top of what remains of ancient Dara. Local residents have used ancient stone in their buildings for generations. Architectural elements from the fortress incorporated into the walls of houses that were built centuries after the last soldiers left. The fortress walls themselves, 2.8 kilometers of them still standing, are visible to visitors willing to make the drive. The great cistern is intact. The necropolis, with its rock-cut tombs carved into the bedrock of the surrounding hills, has been converted into an archaeological park. Excavations that began in 1986 have uncovered approximately 10% of the ancient city, with ongoing work revealing an estimated 10% of what remains beneath the surface. No monument marks the plain south of the village where Faris's 300 Heruli erupted from ambush. No plaque commemorates the location of the trench system that satellite imagery has now approximately identified. No museum preserves the artifacts of a battle that killed over 8,000 Persians in an afternoon. Just agricultural land, summer heat, and the particular silence that settles over places where enormous things happened and then were forgotten. Procopius's phrase lingers. On that day, the Persians had been defeated in battle by the Romans, a thing which had not happened for a long time. What he was recording was not merely a military result. He was recording the moment that a century of assumptions about which empire owned the future of the Eastern Mediterranean had been tested against one afternoon's geometry and found to be wrong. 25,000 men had stood in prepared positions against 50,000 and had not merely survived. They had dismantled the finest cavalry in the ancient world in sequential encirclements so precise that modern military analysts still trace the tactical logic in their classrooms. Belisarius would go on to reconquer North Africa and return Italy to the Roman orbit. He would fight in Syria and on the Danube and outside Constantinople itself against a Hunnic raid when he was in his 50s, and most had forgotten he was still alive. He would eventually be accused of conspiracy against the emperor he had served for 3 decades. The charges, almost certainly false, political rather than substantive, and spend his final years under something between disgrace and house arrest. He died in March 565 AD, only months before Justinian himself. The medieval legend that he was blinded and reduced to begging in the streets of Constantinople, crying for alms, is exactly that. A legend first appearing in sources from the 10th century, debunked by every modern historian who has examined the contemporary evidence. He died in relative political disgrace. He did not die blind and destitute. The irony is perfect and bitter. The empire's greatest general since Julius Caesar, the man who had reconquered Carthage and Rome and stood at the walls of Ravenna, died suspected of treason by the emperor he had made possible. Success guarantees nothing. Loyalty ensures nothing. History remembers the victories and forgets the cost of the man who won them. The trenches Belisarius designed have long since filled with 15 centuries of earth and time. The wrestling instructor who walked out between 2 armies and changed the course of a battle has no memorial. The 8,000 Persian dead have no names in the record that survives. But somewhere in every military institution where smaller forces face larger ones. In every planning room where commanders study the relationship between terrain and numbers and timing and the deployment of reserves at the decisive moment. The principles that made June 530 possible are being reconsidered, not as ancient curiosity, as operational geometry, as the timeless mathematics of the decisive point. Perazes never got his bath. The trenches outlasted the empire that built them, and in a narrow Mesopotamian valley, where the satellite imagery still shows the topography that Procopius described 1496 years ago, the mathematics of one June afternoon remain, waiting for the next commander, arrogant enough to believe that superior numbers make outcome inevitable. They don't. Sometimes geometry decides, and sometimes a man who ran a wrestling school walks out between armies and changes everything, and then disappears, leaving only 2 dead Persian champions and the echo of a roar from walls that are still, partially, standing.